Well, folks, we're going to move to our panel now. We've got about 20 minutes before we have our coffee break, so hang in, keep leaning in. This is the part where we're going to hear from some practitioners who are on the ground making a difference across our state. And I'd like to invite up our first panellist, Pastor Paul Bartlett, who's the senior pastor of Lighthouse in Wollongong for over 19 years. He's recently been appointed as the New South Wales State President of Australian Christian Churches. And in this role, he leads over 300 churches. Paul is also the ACC National Community Engagement Leader, which is a role that sees him influence the way the local church views its role in effectively transforming its community. As the author of the book, Thank God It's Monday, Paul is passionate about empowering people to live lives of significance and helping churches to engage their communities. Would you please welcome Pastor Paul? We'll share the stage for a moment. I'll just ask you a couple of questions before we let you take a seat on the stage, on the panel. Can you tell us a little bit about the communities you're serving and what are the trends you're seeing in the communities you're serving at the moment?
Well, doing community a long time. Firstly, I changed my job description as a senior pastor about 8 years ago. I spend 80% of my time in community spaces. I found myself too often just sitting in churches, hanging out with Christians, and so I've moved myself outside, which is really what's taught me about my journey. I think typically, if I think about over 20 years, I think this is how we used to do church. I think I wrote it down here, we used to invite people, include them, value them, then get to know them. I actually think today it's the complete reverse. I actually think today we have to go and get to know our community, and then when we do that, we become known. I think when we get to know them, we need to then value them. When we value them, they value us. And then I think what happens as a byproduct of those two things, I reckon when we do those first two things, know and value them, they start to include us in their world. And then what we've found at our church and in our churches is that what happens is they start to invite us into their spaces, which we never thought we would happen actually, but they do it.
Fantastic. And a follow-up question. In terms of, I guess, you're leading several different areas of influence at the moment, which sounds like you need a few coffees in the morning, no doubt, but pray more importantly. But can you just share maybe how you're effectively engaging and even allocating the resource? Where do you pick which communities or parts of the communities to engage and serve and build that relationship with?
I think we have, and just remember I'm a senior pastor, but I think we have an unhealthy over-attraction to Sundays. I know we're meant to love Sundays. I'm a pastor, I lead one, but I think it's unusual that we've made Sundays the most spiritual day of the week. In fact, my thinking would be that it's far better to see God and His presence as seamless. In other words, people shouldn't expect that the presence of God radically drops from Sunday to Monday. And so what we've done is taking, both Ruth and Mark have been great. I came today just to get more fodder for preaching, actually. Love a few good stats in there. But one of the things I think, commonplaces. So what we do is I tell our churches, don't build a church, build a community space. And so both of our locations are open 7 days a week. They're around food. I think Jesus ate his way through the Gospels. There's almost not a time where Jesus didn't encounter, I guess, somebody in a transforming way that he wasn't eating food. And so we use our spaces, cafe, restaurants, rentable spaces, that kind of thing. I think that's a great way to spend your resources as you do that. And I think we've got to actually create places that people want to be in naturally, not things that have to get them out of the rhythm of their life. So the goal of connecting with people is join the rhythm of their life, not ask them to step outside of their rhythm and do something foreign to the kind of life that they live. So that's my thought.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pastor Paul. I'll let you grab a seat and we'll be getting another panellist to join you in just a moment. Some great thoughts about the future of community, how to prioritise resource. It's been brilliant. Our next panellist is Rev Simon Hansford, the moderator of the Synod of New South Wales and ACT in the Uniting Church. He has been in full-time ministry for almost 30 years, and most of which has been in rural and regional Australia. Simon is an advocate for the rural community and the rural ministry, which informs his understanding of mission and ministry. He's currently leading a change in how people are formed for ministry in the Uniting Church so that we're better adapted for the context in which we find ourselves. Simon is passionate about being able to articulate the gospel and faith in language which our community can understand and which acknowledges the changing role of the church and in our community. So can you tell us Reverend Simon. A little bit about Simon's, let's go there. Start there, always easy to drop back. Thank you. What trends and changes are you noticing in the communities and drawing on that regional, rural history as well?
Well, when I first started in rural ministry and regional ministry, we would say that we were, in terms of social engagement, quite a distance behind the metropolitan areas. But now the changes are really accelerating into our communities, and I live in Tamworth right now, and one thing we're noticing particularly is a change in the profile of the community and how we're engaging. One of the comments that Simon made, which you made before I made it, but is that comment about a lot of the church folk in regional areas, in the regions and the rural church, often only speak to themselves, and we're involved in the conversation with ourselves about ourselves and don't know how to have the wider conversation. So that's a real challenge for us. That's the rural engagement. Yeah.
And in terms of, I guess, engaging with the rural community, what have you seen that's helped you be effective? Is there any learnings, failures even you're happy to share? And how do you even then prioritise which parts of the community you're engaging with?
Well, as you'd know right now, one of the great challenges for the rural church is drought, and the drought issue is a significant one in terms of impact and transformation, so that rural communities, especially smaller ones right now, are really up against it, and I can't begin to describe how hard it actually is right now. So leaving, as it were, that extraordinarily large elephant in the room to one side, if you use Tamworth as an example, and Dubbo's similar, Coffs Harbour's similar, Armidale's similar, the Wagga's very similar in the sense of the changing profiles in the communities, it's engaging in conversations in a way that are helpful. So, for example, in Tamworth, we had a huge conversation about 15 years ago where the mayor said things like we couldn't have refugees into Tamworth because they wouldn't know how to use bathrooms and toilets and that sort of stuff. Extraordinary xenophobic commentary, which has been changed a great deal, and so now we have this thing called Fiesta La Peel, Peel's our local river, where we have about 80 different nationalities having a food festival and a music festival in town, and about 8,000 to 10,000 people come to that in town, and it was started by members of the different churches who are involved in multicultural Tamworth, trying to build relationships through food and through music. And I think that's no surprise to us at all, but it's also a space where people come for community and have conversations within that space rather than they come because the church has invited them to that space. So that's the sort of thing we're talking about, I think, as part of today. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to have more time for questions. Thank you, Simon. I'll let you take your seat. I might invite our other speakers this morning, Simon, Mark and Ruth, to come and join us. And if you haven't yet been to slido.com and used the code SUM19, we'd love to hear your questions. We've got a few that will come through, no doubt, over the morning. But I do want to begin with, I guess, asking particularly our practitioners in the room, Simon and Paul, looking at what, with Ruth's session around the invitational culture, what are you seeing in terms of that on the ground? What's the attitude? How are you equipping members in your churches around that invitational approach to services? Maybe I'll start with you, Paul.
Well, I think it was good to hear about the relationship side. So I was the chaplain for an NBL basketball team, the Hawks, for 17 years, just handed it over this year. And it taught me that those men, very tall men, by the way, I was the short guy, those very tall men are interested in faith, just not church. And in fact, they regularly talk to me about God in many contexts, but I could never get them to come on Sundays. We have a great church, great music, all that sort of stuff, but they would not come. And so I think we don't necessarily tell people we tell people this: don't invite people unless they trust you, because you're only going to make their experience of God worse. So if you have people that don't like you, that don't trust you, and you have no credibility with them, you're going to invite them to a room of what they think is more people like you, then that's not a great scenario for us. So we overemphasize relationships, and we think that with very good relationships, the inviting is a natural process, not a forced process as well. Yeah.
Just thinking about the hospitality issue, which I think is really important, and I think often in churches we talk about being a welcoming church, and that's very different to hospitality. I think welcoming is the door. I think hospitality is the culture in the community. And I think there's a high level of suspicion about in the community about what hospitality is about, that there's a hidden agenda behind the hospitality. And I think we need to be working really hard at how that hospitality works out and how it actually in itself has integrity and character. And that's important. And I notice, for example, in our congregations where I would say marked helpful and hopeful changes happening. They're working at hospitality in a range of ways, whether it's in the inner city with the changing cultures from poverty to gentrification, or whether it's our islander communities who are doing wonderful things with a wide sense of hospitality, but it's also in churches where it isn't working well, and they're talking to themselves and saying, well, we all like it here, why doesn't anybody else like it? And the answer is, well, have you talked to them at all? No. So. Sorry?
Keep moving. We're just sharing a mic, so we're working with it. What we're doing, I guess, is looking at the questions that have come through. So thank you for many people who've asked some great questions. Might throw this to sort of the research experts in the room. What research has been done about being church beyond the church building? And is that things like, for example, Scripture, SRE in New South Wales? And what impact do going out actions have on faith participation? So Ruth or Mark, any thoughts on how can the church be beyond the church building?
Okay, one of the things that we've done over many years is looked at what we call new initiatives in church life, and we've tried to do a bit of an audit of that, and we're hoping to do more work on that. And that's actually acknowledging that new initiatives actually cover a whole range of things. For some people it's a new worship service, others it's a group, sometimes it's meeting in a third space, building a missional community, and sometimes it's a classic church plant as well. And all of these opportunities. And I think there's the Fresh Expressions movement that's come from the UK. There's things like Messy Church. There's all sorts of examples of people trying to be church. I read something interesting the other day, which is again from the Fresh Expressions movement, which answers the question, or has a go at that, well, is it really church, these things? And that's been an ongoing dialogue, perhaps, of going, that thing that you're calling church, I don't recognise, is it really church? And they gave what I thought was quite helpful. They said, let's go back to the Nicene Creed and look for one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. And they gave a few things and going, if we're being one, which is about drawing people together, if we're being holy, drawing people to Jesus, apostolic, reaching out, and Catholic is sort of, well, we're doing it out of a tradition of the Christian church in its entirety. And I went, all right, that works for many new initiatives.
It's thinking about I love the stats there, and Ruth was putting them up there. The 52% of Australians say Christianity in the census, 16% of them 16% of the population are attending church, so there's 36% that say Christianity in the census and don't go anywhere to church. And so that's the church that doesn't go to church. How can we connect with them? We've done a lot of research across, for example, Christian schools. 40% of Australian young people go to non-government schools, and the fastest growing sector are Christian schools. The majority of them are not, or a lot of them that attend are not church-going, but the parents are saying, I want some religious input, I want some values-based education. So that's where the church that doesn't go to church goes. We've done work with Christian media, that tune in to Christian stations. And our research of those listeners is not that they're churchgoers or Christians, but they want values-based content. The commercial radio stuff that they hear is not suitable for the kids that are in their car. And so they're looking for that connection. Christians in the workplace, we've done a bit of analysis there, and you've got Ruth's excellent summary of how the workplace can be transformed through Christians. And I think there's another avenue for Christians to be real influencers in our society. Not by getting the society to come into the church doors, but through these other areas, connecting with those who have warmth but wouldn't otherwise come.
Also just speak to the engagement of community services. I think I've watched a journey where the church has sort of looked out at schools and its community services and said, we started you with a particular purpose in mind, but you're a long way away now, and there's been a bit of a tug, if you like, on those two directions in terms of, hey, let's actually work this out. Just as I've been travelling the country and starting to speak with denominational leaders, I'm already hearing a different positioning of community services where it's like they've turned around and are facing the church, because it's all expressions of church, but facing and saying, we need to work out where our common ground is, how we can be a most excellent service with all the regulation and all the requirements, etc., and do what we're supposed to do as professional agencies, but we are facing the church and looking for that space. Some extraordinarily interesting things are going on in terms of shared spaces, which is again about use of buildings and collaborative shared spaces. So that's going to be, I think, an exciting thing to watch that as well as the schools.
Good. Well, just a question about the future generations, our Gen Zs and our Millennials. The question is, and I might maybe Mark get you to start with this one, but maybe some practitioners with some examples as well. Do you see great potential or grave risk in building digital communities of faith for Gen Z and Millennials? What do you think, Mark?
Well, social media is called that for a reason. You know, people do socially connect, people do network through those digital channels. But we also know from our understanding of ontology and how we're made in God's image that digital connection won't suffice, because we're built for that relational engagement beyond just the digital intangible connection. But it's an excellent connection point. You find, just even in a secular environment, people will use social media to meet, to connect, to facilitate friendships that they have offline, or they'll make friends that they then facilitate offline. And I think the church can use that same recipe. Let's use the best of the technology, but let's not think that that's a substitute for church.
Ruth, in previous couple of sessions, you've talked about the future of church, that demographic shift that's going to be coming and the need for leadership and transitions in leadership. Do you want to even just articulate a few of those thoughts? I know I might have said them already, but any further things you'd like to add?
About transitions of leadership? Yeah, okay. I think that one of the things that I'll speak to in our next session, which is looking at trends within church life, having focused in this session on the community, one of the things we see is that age is a key driver for the future of the church. And what we know is that the church attending age profile is much older than the wider community. That's not true in every denomination, but it's a key driver and attending to this. And so this generational transmission of faith is really key. And I've been really reflecting as we've been travelling together on sort of two parts. One is, when is it correct to actually focus on a particular generation and understand that group as a cohort with their unique character, etc., and to engage? And then when is it the time for us to actually engage intergenerationally and looking for the both and? Because what we have learned, though, about the sociological term is religious socialisation, but how critical it is in terms of passing on of faith. It happens from generation to generation, and people who do not have someone passing on faith within the family, again, the mother is the most important person to pass on faith, followed by the father. Who are the role models for faith? It is your direct family. And what we'll speak to again in our next session is the fact that unless we equip our families to pass on faith to other family members, we have not understood the importance of how it actually works. And that's, rather than equipping people to share faith with strangers or even friends, it's like, how do you equip mums and dads to speak with their children and children's children about faith? That's, I think, going to be really key.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Love hearing that. And a question for you, Simon. Thanks for being on the panel. This one's primed for you. Is the negativity to Christian comment in the media about the speaker's Christian identity or about what they say? So is it more the person or the message?
Well, it could be both. But what you have got to, because of whatever's led up to the point we're at now, you do have a situation where, oh, you're the Christian. There's a whole lot of assumptions that are going to go with that. So you might be perfectly acceptable, except the assumption is you're going to be unpleasant and you're going to be a jerk. One of our aims in CPX is a low bar, you might understand, is when we appear in any sort of media, is to be less of a jerk than people thought we were going to be. And if we can pull that off, we think that's a step, towards God. So you might consider that a low bar. But it's both. It's both, really. I will say, though, whatever you think about this, when the people who get traction in a positive way are people who are very clearly advocating for something other than ourselves. So when you're clearly speaking for and acting on behalf of people who really need help or whatever it might be, then you are there's much more of an open door there. People recognise that, they respect it, and even if you're a Christian, they think, okay, no, that's good. So I think it's a bit of both, but these are some of the realities that you have to assume. And I just assume too that, okay, we've had a lot of time with the keys to the kingdom, and maybe we should just get used to not having that and cop a bit along the way. You know, there is a sense which we've kind of not always done well with that, so let's accept the consequences for it. So you're going to expect a bit of pushback. I think that's okay, actually. I think we can, you know, not get too worked up about it. It's hard, though. Can I just say something about the other thing here, too, because I am on the panel, I better say something. But in terms of church and what it is, I think there's a tension in terms of where we've got to take the church and what, partly because if we are a culture, for instance, that is dominated by consumerism, we're consumers all the time, we're also individualists, and we also think that freedom, this is our culture, we have a definition of freedom that's all about unlimited choice. And we think that's what freedom is, which I think is a terribly impoverished version of freedom. Somehow or other, as we try to adapt and find ways to connect, I do think we've also got to offer something different and offer something that is much more difficult maybe and more demanding, but also more life-giving. And I think there's a real tension there. I think it's not easy to navigate that, but I think it's a real question for people because without that, we're missing something really important that we can offer.
I've got another good one here, which we'll just go for another couple of minutes, folks. The coffee's going to be nice and warm in a minute, but some great questions coming through. We won't have time for all of them, but maybe just this is our final one and we can have a final rounding out discussion on this. It's a great question. How can we help other Christians to understand how to explain their faith in words someone non-religious can understand that won't repel them as weird? If we can solve that today, I think we've done our job here, I think. So I hope you're praying. Let's hear what we've got. Who wants to start us off?
So one of the challenges is we've made sharing our faith highly over-spiritual and we've made it highly complex. So we changed our language around the way we help our people engage others. So for example, we taught our people discipleship or even sharing your faith is coffee with intention. So Australians love coffee. We're always doing it. I do this with the basketball players when I would meet with them. As we're having coffee, we're obviously talking about life. I would end the conversation by saying this. Hey, we've had a great discussion today. I just wonder after I leave today, is there just one thing I could pray for you about? And they would say it. And then when I meet them in 2 or 3 weeks, I say, hey, listen, I've been praying for that. How did it go? I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times. No non-Christian has ever said to me, no, you're not praying for me. Because prayer, actually, by the way, is one of those things that is actually it's a care language. When you say you want to pray, it's caring. So if we can demystify and simplify the language of evangelism, in fact, don't even use that word. We don't use evangelism, don't use the word outreach. Outreach is a program, right? Outreach requires a budget, it requires a date, and the fanatical few. It's like the castle mentality. This is what we say, castle mentality. Your church, my church is like the castle. Somebody says, oh, we haven't been out for a while. Let's put it on the calendar. Let's find the weird evangelists. We lower the drawbridge. We get on our horses, out in the community, touch a few people. Thank God they didn't touch us. Get back on our horses, back inside the church. High five each other. That was awesome. Love doing that. We must do that again sometime and go back to all the castle-like things we were doing before. So the community is not interested in them being the subject of our agenda that we write into every now and then. My suggestion is that we immerse ourselves in community. It's not even engagement, it's immersion. It's recognising we're a valuable part of the community. We should speak to humans, not to Christians. If you speak human, everybody can listen. If you speak Christian, just the only friends you've got will listen to you. And so my recommendation is slow it down, simplify it, and give it a language that everybody can understand.
And we've got a Monty Python joke, which is really great. I think if we keep hospitality at the centre of this conversation, if we're in a relationship with somebody, then we're involved in the conversation about their life and their concerns and their joys and their frustrations, what football team they follow or don't follow, and that helps us understand how to share faith with them. And I mean, the other day our air conditioner broke down and it's an evaporative air conditioner, so we needed a plumber, and the plumber came to the house. It was 5 years ago when he last came to our house. He said, I know you're involved in the life of the church. What do you think about this? And so we're actually having a conversation based upon 5-year spasmodic visits, but he thinks it's an important conversation. He said, I'm so pleased to talk to you because this is really important. And we had this 5-minute, 10-minute conversation around what was important to him about his kids and his kids' life and what was happening for them right there and then in my driveway in 37-degree heat. But you have the conversation where it is rather than trying to create it by, as it were, lowering the drawbridge. And I think if we're beginning in hospitality, beginning in relationship, we then know how to talk about what's important to us rather than thinking, as when I was raised in youth groups and church structure, which was you've got this desperate amount of time to save their souls, and if you don't do it, God can't do anything, which is, apart from being heretical, is also a myth. And I think that's the great danger, is that God's in control of this space. Our task is to be faithful and to bear witness in that space rather than trying to take God's control into our own hands and doing it for God instead.
Yeah, people often feel the stress and the pressure, don't they? Our church members, other Christians we come across, what am I going to say? How am I going to answer that question? How will I articulate the gospel? But we've got to take the pressure off and let them know they might not be called to be evangelists. They might not be called to be apologists or philosophers, but they're called to be witnesses. And that's telling our story. That's all that they're asked to do. Tell your story, like what Jesus has done for you. Tell others that. And it's speaking to the heart to heart, not head to head. And we're in a very intellectual time, and people think they need to philosophize. They watch Q&A and they think, oh, how am I going to deal with that tricky one or this tricky one? But we're called by Christ to be his witnesses through Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth where we are. And it's just telling the story.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Thanks for those things. I mean, speak to the humans, absolutely right, isn't it? It's because the longings of the human heart haven't changed. People change, society changes, but those things, the longing for my life to mean something beyond whatever I can kind of drum up within myself, the longing for community, the longing for justice, the longing for... there's all sorts of things that I think it's finding a way. Often what we describe at CPX is what we're trying to do is find a way into a conversation about this. And that takes a bit of care and a bit of thought. But as you say, more just a bit of love for people. And I loved your point about if you don't actually love these people, don't do it because you'll mess it up. We'd rather you didn't do it. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. But we should have a confidence about this, right? To just be in with people and share your life with them, knowing that you have the greatest gift to offer them, really. And you don't have to be kind of so strategic about it, but just live with people and it sort of emerges naturally. I think that's really important, actually.
Well, that is the conclusion of our panel. And before I release you for coffee, I want to say thank you to our panellists. Thank you to our attendees for asking great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. The panel will be sticking around, so please come and chat with the relevant person for your questions.